The Mysterious Letter. Part 1. A Strange Envelope. Sophie was a curious girl. She loved books, puzzles, and mysteries. Ever since she was a child, she had spent hours reading detective novels, imagining herself as a great investigator. One rainy afternoon, she sat in her small apartment, wrapped in a warm blanket, reading The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. The sound of raindrops tapping against the window made the moment even cozier. Suddenly, she heard the mailbox open. Thump! A letter fell onto the floor. Sophie frowned. Who sends letters these days? She got up, stretched, and picked up the envelope. It was yellowed with age, and the ink on the front looked slightly smudged. There was no return address, only her name, Sophie Miller. A strange feeling crept over her. Was it a mistake? A joke? Carefully, she opened it and pulled out a single sheet of paper. The message was simple. Meet me at the old oak tree in Greenfield Park at 3 p.m. tomorrow. I have something important to tell you. There was no signature. Sophie's heart started to beat faster. Who wrote this? And what do they want? She whispered to herself. Her best friend Jake lived next door. He was the first person she thought of when something strange happened. Without hesitating, she grabbed her phone and called him. Jake, I just got a really weird letter. Can you come over? Part 2. A Plan for the Meeting. Jake arrived a few minutes later, shaking off the rain from his jacket. He was tall, with messy brown hair and an adventurous spirit. He loved mysteries just as much as Sophie did. A mysterious letter? That sounds exciting, he said, grabbing the paper from her hands. He read it twice. This is like a scene from a movie, Sophie crossed her arms. Or a crime story. What if it's dangerous? Jake smirked. Or what if it's fun? Sophie sighed. Do you think I should go? Jake thought for a moment. I think if we go together, it should be fine. If anything seems weird, we leave. Simple. She nodded. All right, let's do it. They made a plan. They would arrive early to check the place. They would bring their phones just in case. If anything felt wrong, they would leave immediately. Also, Jake said with a grin, bring a notebook. Every good detective takes notes. Sophie laughed. All right, Detective Jake, let's solve this mystery. Part 3. The Meeting. The next day, the sun was shining and the air smelled fresh after the rain. Greenfield Park was a large, peaceful place with green fields, a small pond, and a few wooden benches. Families walked their dogs, children played, and the occasional jogger passed by. Sophie and Jake found the old oak tree easily. It was massive, its thick branches stretching wide, its golden leaves glowing in the sunlight. Beneath it stood a simple wooden bench. Nobody was there. Jake checked his watch. Are we early? Sophie shook her head. No, it's exactly 3 p.m. They waited. 5 minutes, 10 minutes. Sophie sighed. Maybe it's a joke. Just then, a shadow moved behind the tree. A woman stepped out. She was in her 60s, with gray hair in a bun and round glasses. She wore a long brown coat and held a small leather bag. Are you Sophie Miller? She asked in a soft, careful voice. Sophie hesitated, then nodded. Yes. The woman smiled. I knew your grandmother. Part 4. A Secret Message. My grandmother? Sophie asked, her heart racing. Yes, the woman said gently. She and I were best friends. Before she passed away, she asked me to give you something when the time was right. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small old book with a leather cover. It smelled of dust and history. Sophie took it carefully. What is this? Open it. Inside there were handwritten notes in faded ink. The handwriting looked familiar. My grandmother's handwriting, Sophie whispered. The woman nodded. Your grandmother loved riddles. She wanted you to have this book when you were ready. Ready for what? Sophie asked, feeling a mix of excitement and confusion, to solve the biggest mystery of all, your family's secret. Part 5. The First Clue. Sophie turned to the first page. There was a single sentence written in blue ink. Begin where your heart feels most at home. Sophie looked at Jake. What does that mean? Jake tapped his chin. Home? Your apartment? Sophie frowned. Maybe, but I feel like it means something deeper, somewhere special to me. She thought for a moment. Then her eyes lit up. My grandmother's bookstore. Her grandmother used to own a small bookstore in town. It was Sophie's favorite place as a child. She spent hours there, reading, helping her grandmother organize books, and listening to her stories. Jake grinned. That sounds like the perfect place to start. Part 6. A journey begins that evening. Sophie and Jake visited the old bookstore. It had closed years ago, but the building was still there. They walked around, looking for clues. Then Sophie noticed something strange, a small symbol carved into the wooden door. A tiny owl, just like the ones her grandmother used to love. Sophie's heart pounded. I think we just found our next clue, she whispered. Jake smiled. And I think this adventure is just getting started. Chapter 7. The Hidden Door. Sophie ran her fingers over the carved owl. The symbol was deeply engraved, as if it was meant to be a clue. This must mean something, she said, staring at the old wooden door. Jake knocked on different parts of the door, listening carefully. Hey, this part sounds hollow. Maybe there's a hidden compartment? Sophie stepped back and looked around. She remembered something her grandmother always told her. Sometimes the answers are right in front of you. She carefully pressed different sections of the door. Suddenly, one of the wooden panels shifted slightly under her touch. Click. Something inside the mechanism moved, and the panel slid open, revealing a small hidden compartment. Inside there was an old, time-worn key. Sophie carefully picked it up and held it in her palm. This is definitely part of the puzzle. Jake nodded. But what does it open? Chapter 8. Searching for the lock. Sophie and Jake started searching the bookstore. The front door was locked, and the windows were covered with old wooden shutters. This key is too small for the front door, Sophie guessed. Maybe it's for a box or a drawer? Jake glanced around. Maybe there's a back entrance? They walked around the building and spotted a small door in the back. It looked old and worn, but it had a massive padlock on it. Sophie sighed. This key is way too small for that. She examined the key carefully. A tiny star symbol was engraved on the metal. Does this mean anything? She asked. Jake thought for a moment. Wait, didn't your grandmother love collecting old music boxes? Sophie's eyes widened. Yes, and she had one special box with a star on the lid. Chapter 9. The Old Music Box. Sophie knew exactly where the box was. After her grandmother passed away, her mother had taken some of her belongings, and the music box was among them. We need to go to my mom's house, she said, slipping the key into her pocket. They quickly made their way there. Sophie's mother greeted them with a warm smile. Are you looking for something? She asked. Mom, do you still have Grandma's music box? Sophie asked, excitement in her voice. Her mother nodded and went to the storage room. A minute later she returned, holding a small wooden box with a star engraved on the lid. Sophie carefully inserted the key into the tiny lock and turned it. Click. The lock opened. Inside there were a few old photographs, a letter, and a small golden locket. Chapter 10. A Message from the Past. Sophie unfolded the letter. The handwriting was neat and familiar. My dearest Sophie, If you are reading this letter, it means you have accepted the challenge and followed the clues. I always knew you had a curious mind and a brave heart. This locket is your legacy. It has been passed down in our family for generations. It represents wisdom and strength. Wear it with pride and remember, sometimes the most important answers are not found in books, but in your heart. With love, your grandmother. Sophie's eyes filled with tears. Jake smiled. That was a real adventure. Sophie held the locket tightly in her hand. Yes, and I feel like this is just the beginning. Chapter 11. The Secret Inside the Locket. Sophie turned the locket over in her hand. It was beautifully crafted, with delicate engravings along the edges. As she traced the patterns with her fingers, she felt something unusual. One of the engravings was slightly raised. Curious, she pressed it. Click. The locket popped open, revealing a tiny folded piece of paper inside. Jake leaned in. What does it say? Sophie carefully unfolded the fragile note. The handwriting was small but clear. Look beneath the owl's watchful eye, Sophie gasped. The owl! The symbol on the bookstore door. Jake's eyes widened. You think there's more hidden there? Sophie nodded. There's only one way to find out. Chapter 12. The Final Discovery. That evening, Sophie and Jake returned to the old bookstore. The door was still locked, but Sophie wasn't interested in going inside this time. She shone a flashlight over the owl carving, searching for anything unusual. There has to be something, she murmured. Then she saw it, a tiny hole just beneath the owl's eye, almost invisible in the woodwork. With trembling fingers, she held up the locket. The back had a small pointed tip that matched the hole perfectly. Taking a deep breath, Sophie inserted the locket into the slot and turned it. Click! The owl carving shifted slightly and a hidden panel in the door slid open. Inside was a small velvet-lined compartment, and resting in the center was an old leather-bound journal. Sophie carefully picked it up. The cover was embossed with her grandmother's initials. This belonged to her, Sophie whispered. Jake peered over her shoulder. What do you think is inside? Sophie hesitated, then slowly opened the first page. And as she began to read, she realized this was more than just a book. It was the story of her family's past, and she was about to uncover secrets that had been hidden for generations. Chapter 13. Secrets of the Past. Sophie ran her fingers over the yellowed pages of the journal. It looked ancient but well preserved. On the first page, written in careful handwriting, were the words, "This journal belongs to Eleanor Baker. If you have found it, then you are part of this story." Sophie held her breath. This was my grandmother's. She flipped the page and began reading. May 24th, 1952. Today I discovered something that has been hidden in our family for decades. A small silver locket, passed down from generation to generation. They say it is the key to our family's greatest secret, but no one knows what it truly opens yet. Sophie and Jake exchanged glances. So even your grandmother didn't know what the locket was for? Jake asked in surprise. Sophie kept reading. June 15th, 1952. I have spent weeks searching for answers. Finally, I found a clue in my grandfather's old letters. He wrote about a hidden place in the bookstore where he once worked. He called it the heart of the home. I believe this could be the library. Sophie frowned. The heart of the home, couldn't that be the bookstore itself? Jake thought for a moment. Maybe it's a specific room inside? Or a place that was important to her? Sophie turned a few more pages. July 1st, 1952. I found it behind the old bookshelf in the store. There was a small wooden box, and inside, a letter. In it, I discovered that our family—" The entry ended abruptly. Sophie flipped through the journal, but the rest of the pages were blank. "That's it?" she whispered, disappointed. "Maybe there's something else," Jake suggested. Sophie looked closely at the book's spine. It was tightly bound, but in one spot the stitching seemed slightly loose. Carefully she pried it open. A hidden note was tucked inside. "If you are reading this, it means you have found the journal. The truth is closer than you think. Look beneath the heart of the home." Sophie's breath caught. "We need to go back to the bookstore." Chapter 14. The Final Discovery. Late that night, when the streets were empty, Sophie and Jake returned to the old bookstore. If the heart of the home is the bookstore, what does beneath mean? Sophie wondered. Jake glanced around. Maybe under the floor? They stepped inside. The shop was silent, the only light coming from the street lamps outside. Sophie tapped her foot on the wooden floor. A hollow sound. She took a step to the side. Tap, tap. The tone changed. "Here!" she whispered excitedly. They found a small trapdoor hidden beneath an old rug. Sophie lifted it carefully, revealing a narrow staircase leading down. Her heart pounded. They descended cautiously, entering a small stone-walled room. On the walls hung old family portraits, covered in dust. In the center of the room stood a wooden chest. Sophie hesitated for a moment, then opened it. Inside were stacks of old letters, documents, and one single envelope with her grandmother's name on it. With trembling fingers, she opened the envelope and began to read. "My dearest Sophie, if you are reading this, then you have found what I could not share with you in life. Our family's past is not just a story. It is a legacy. There were things I could never speak of, secrets that had to remain hidden for years. Inside this chest, you will find letters that tell the truth about who we were, where we came from, and why some things had to be kept a secret. I had always hoped you would be the one to uncover it. Know that I have always been proud of you. With love, Grandma Eleanor." Sophie felt tears welling in her eyes. Jake looked over her shoulder. "So, what's the secret?" Sophie took a deep breath, picking up one of the old letters. "Let's find out. The end, or just the beginning." Chapter 15. The Truth Hidden in Time. Sophie carefully unfolded the old letters, her hands trembling slightly. She was afraid of what she might discover. The first letter was handwritten by her grandmother, Eleanor. "My dearest Sophie, if you are reading this, it means you have found what I have kept hidden for so long. There has been a secret in our family that could not be revealed earlier. For many years, I have kept documents that could change the fate of our family. In this chest, you will find the ownership papers for this bookstore. This store has belonged to our family for generations, but after the war, it was taken from us unlawfully. I managed to keep the proof that it is rightfully ours. I wanted to reclaim it, but the times were difficult, and I feared the consequences. Now you are the only one who can set things right. All the documents are here. If you choose to take it back, know that this place has always been a part of our family. I have always been proud of you. With love, your grandmother, Eleanor." Sophie froze. "This bookstore, it belongs to my family?" Jake leaned over and pulled out the yellowed papers. "These are official documents. Your grandmother kept the evidence all this time.